Let's open it up to questions, see if some of you have some questions for Janet, Morgan, or Mark. And while you're making your way to the microphones, looks like some of you are already there. Good. Let's start with the gentleman on my right.
Hi, I'm Rich Hallett with U.S. Forest Service, New York City Urban Field Station. I really enjoyed your talks, and I'd like to challenge the group and maybe get a response from the panel. Mark, I liked your idea of national standards on canopy assessment. The thing is, with the Million Trees campaigns and the campaigns for targets of canopy cover and the impacts on human health, we're not thinking about the tree's health. So, Million Tree campaign in New York City, you get 1 million trees, green up, brown down, you're good to go, right? We're losing canopy in our cities. If we could figure out if the trees are getting stressed or sick before they're dead and do something about it, we may be able to reverse that trend. I would suggest adding some metrics to the report cards of how you're taking care of your trees once they're in the ground. So I'll just comment and see if there's any response, but just something for the group to think about.
Mark, go ahead.
Am I on?
Yep.
Yeah, I would say don't worry about it. I mean, it's far too detailed. You know, you can do that. You can do all kinds of things. But when it comes right down to it, what you need to do is have some kind of a maintenance plan. But the problem is that we don't know. The longest term study I've seen with mortality was one out of Philadelphia. I think there's probably others out there. Again, I don't comb the journals, so I could be wrong. But the one that I saw from Philadelphia showed about a 50 or 60% mortality rate after 10 years, okay? So just take that as a given. We're seeing about 20% in the district, maybe 30% with what we're putting in the ground, okay? So I think as a group, we need to say, okay, so what are those mortality rates and why? It takes so much time to mobilize to go back to help a tree that's dying. Plant it right in the first place and just water the thing. One of the things that we've done at KC Trees is, and it's been really a great relationship with UFA. They're doing such a great job on the street trees. They're one of the best staffed and funded urban forestry units on the East Coast on a per capita and per tree basis. And it's fantastic to see a mayoral investment in that. We have shifted to the private lots by and large because that's the niche we can fill really well, okay? And you know, what we are doing is we plant and we track to see what those mortality rates are. But one thing that we do that is maybe a little bit of a spin on what Morgan had spoken about is we're an equal opportunity tree planter. We'll plant with anybody, okay? We have found that it is economically not viable to work in neighborhoods where it's hard to plant trees. We just can't do it. So we will respond to folks as they ask us to plant with them. And it's been tremendously successful, tremendously successful. We turned that whole model on its head. We really wanted to plant in disadvantaged neighborhoods and so on. We still do a lot of that, but we only do it when someone asks us to do it. And it's been very successful for us. So it's something to think about in terms of mortality rates and all those kinds of things.
And I would just add that I think that we focus a lot on trying to increase maintenance, and I think sometimes we have, and my kids know, like we're driving down the street and you see all the volcano, you know, with all the mulch, and they're like, Dad's gonna blow it, you know, because it's just, you see all this energy going in to maintain these trees, and they're killing the trees, and it drives me nuts, you know. So, but I really don't know where to go with it because, you know, I can't go remulch every tree in the city. But yeah, so I'll stop there. But I think that we have a lot of times where we have people just doing a really good job of taking care of trees, but they're doing it wrong, right? And how do we appropriately direct that energy?
The only thing I would add is that that this is an issue that intersects for a city that might want to put a tree planting program into an air quality program because people need to understand how long those trees are going to be around and be providing that air quality service. So whether you have a system that maintains it all the way out or at least predictably doesn't, we have to be able to quantify it in some way.
Okay, question over here.
Hi, my name's Chris. I'm with the Federal Aviation Administration, but I'm not here representing the FAA. I'm actually here on my own personal time. And my question is about air quality and maybe more generally about some of the basic science that we use in models, which I was hoping to hear a little bit more about in this panel. I recognize that the level is more on management, but there's a strong connection between the two because, at least talking a little bit about my world, when it comes to air quality, we still have a couple of basic things to work out. So we know about nitrates and sulfates, I think, pretty well. We know about black carbon, but it's the organic aerosols where the state of science is very active. And in fact, secondary organic aerosol modelers use this term non-traditional SOA, which I think is their code for saying we're not really sure what this stuff is. And that's a real problem, I think, for urban forests because trees are a major source of organic compounds. And so if we're looking at, okay, so that's one part, that's the composition, especially of particles, and we know that particles have a major impact on human health. So the link between particle exposure and early death is pretty strong. And both EPA and DOT value the avoided mortality of even one person at order of magnitude millions of dollars. So if you put that into a cost benefit, the value of that way outweighs avoided hospital admissions and avoided lost work days and so on. So that kind of drives a cost benefit analysis, which you might use in a regulatory setting. Yet if you're using an air quality model and you're looking off into the future for your state implementation plan, I can honestly say, having looked in these areas just from my own air quality background, that it's very hard to trust a 4-kilometer, 1-hour time step model at the kinds of spatial scales and temporal scales of a park, which is like 100 meters and seconds to minutes. So you run a model at those scales that's not designed for it, it's kind of hard to trust the output. And so that has big implications for what you're doing on the regulatory side, whether it's regulatory compliance or even designing a new bright line standard. So I'm interested to hear from people, which maybe is on the panel, but also perhaps others like Dave, and unfortunately Jonathan from the EPA yesterday couldn't be here. When it comes to air quality, at least, which is just a small part of the overall picture, do we think we have the models there yet to actually drive decisions on urban forestry?
Well, I'll take a little whack at that, and then others may want to chip in. I think you're reflecting the fact that our tools were developed with certain kinds of air quality programming in mind, and haven't caught up or aren't suitable for the kinds of things that people are looking at, which is why states have been clamoring to EPA to sort of loosen up a little bit and provide some space for programs that don't fit that model, can't be analyzed using those tools, but can be demonstrated to have actual beneficial impacts on air quality to be usable. And that's starting with the guidance I was describing in 2004, which looked at voluntary programs, and then through the energy efficiency guidance that we just put out, we're trying to move ourselves in that direction. But I don't have an answer. You make a very, very valid point. You're not going to use the same kind of analytical tools to evaluate the air quality impacts of these kinds of programs.
I understand that there's a focus on the models, but my understanding from what I hear through Dave and my conversations with EPA about the whole issue with air quality and water quality and in a regulatory context is the regulators want to know whether or not you're actually managing trees as though it is an asset. Okay, so industry thinks about asset management and what is your level of asset management. And this is part of, like, you think of it, you know, you give a report card, it's asset management. Can you guarantee that that tree is there and that you are taking care of it? Just as we asked Pepco, great example of, like, what are they doing good asset management on their electrical lines, right? So, and can the city of Baltimore take credit for the private asset? So there are these property rights that get into things as well, and it seems to me like that's going to be the huge hurdle, is what is the level of acceptance of the regulators in terms of this as an asset, and what's the level of asset management that we have to have. And the cities are slow to really kind of be willing to call trees an asset like that, because it raises the bar, because they know what asset management is of your storm water pipes and of your roads and things like that. And there's kind of that level of professionalism and investment. And if they're going to actually try to use trees for that compliance, and they have to think about an asset, they have to put more money into it, they have to have a better inventory for it. And I think that there's this kind of uneasy dance about this, and it's not resolved yet.
I'd like to add to that, if I may, just a moment, and I'd like you to call your attention to several of the slides that these and previous presenters used. If in fact you want to encourage urban tree canopy to be a more vital and important part of air quality planning, you have to recognize that that's a two-edged sword. You can't merely think about the benefits of urban tree canopy in a positive sense. You've got to recognize that if you made it more of a mandatory measure as opposed to a voluntary innovative measure, you'd have to begin to recognize that most urban areas are losing urban tree canopy. And that means that a mandatory measure characterized in that way would immediately penalize those communities because of a loss of the asset that is being described. And ultimately, if you have to have an enforceable standard that talks about, remember how Janet talked about it, additive, permanent, quantifiable, and enforceable. All of those variables raise significant questions about how you would manage the local resource to actually achieve those kinds of benefits. And quantify and monitor change over time. We're much better at describing land cover than we used to be. We're now evolving, particularly over the last, remember she mentioned 204. If you stop to think about the changes that have occurred in the tools that are available to quantify these benefits in the last 10 years, and you just looked at what Dave has been doing. Dave's work was largely in its infancy 10 years ago. We were at U4. iTree didn't even exist. And so we've evolved these tools. So as we begin to become better capable of quantifying these measures, estimating the land cover benefits, and looking to project what they will be, there is one other significant issue in this thing. The input-output model that EPA has used in air quality planning is basically a short-term model, looking at monitored results in a 3 to 5 year time period. Well, look at this. If you planted a tree today, how much benefit do you think you would achieve based on leaf area index for particulate reduction, based on quantifiable other ecological service benefits in such a short period of time? A tree is a long-term measure. So in part, we have to be better at estimating, quantifying, and projecting our benefits, and the agency has to demonstrate greater flexibility in how it will account for and credit those benefits. But the key factor, in my judgment, is that most of the low-hanging fruit has already been tapped by the current regulatory environment. And so urban tree canopy is one of the new innovative measures that increasingly local governments will want to turn to for a variety of reasons. And it's important to look at the air quality benefits, but it's equally important that when a local government sees planting a tree as an air quality benefit for which they can get credit, for when they see it as a water quality benefit for which they can get credit, for when they see it as a quality of life benefit for which their own community will recognize, and when they begin to categorize all these other benefits that Morgan listed, for example, in the beginning of his presentation, each one of those is an additional motivation to choose that as a strategy for addressing ecological service benefits to that community. And additively, they constitute the decision matrix that local government will finally choose to make an investment in urban forestry. All we have to do is make sure that somebody is out there listening to what these benefits are and buying into the kind of quantification of benefits and their projection long-term that we've talked about here in this workshop. So air quality is a key part of that is one of the potential future drivers of air quality of ecological service benefits, but it's not the only one. We've got to show that there's a good deal of overlap because, as we mentioned earlier, if you plant a tree for one reason, it provides all those other things as well. It's a neat little cheap investment to do that kind of thing. Is there another question? Oh, sure. Go ahead, sir.
This is Ian. So I had a small technicality comment and then sort of just really a lot of great things to say about some of the work that's going on, and I think maybe a suggestion for a next step coming from the urban tree canopy assessment background. So the first part, Mark, the costs and the percentages for the 2011 stuff was quite a ways off. So it was 37%, so it was only a 1% difference from the 5-year period, the 2006. So I think you had 38. So 2% of the city obviously would be a huge amount, and then the cost was quite a bit higher, and there's a lot of other tools that went into that. So I think it'd be, as we go on this and talk about consistency and assessments, I think it'd be really good to, what we've been driving on is, are communities using a UTC assessment? How much can they really truly use this as a tool? And I think, Morgan had great examples. So some of the costs, I think, are a little higher because we're really trying to come up with new ways about getting to people really to, whether they have good GIS skills or not, what other tools can they be using? So we have a lot of great ideas. And I think what I'd like to see, Morgan, is it was great stuff, and we're doing a lot of similar things. You can only prioritize where you can plant a tree in so many ways, obviously. But I really like a lot of the things you put together. I would like to figure out, and this is that next step suggestion, is we're doing some work with Virginia, and there's going to be 4 communities out of the 27 that have had the UTC assessments, and we're going to help them come up with an implementation plan, so a canopy implementation plan. I would love to use some of the processes that you guys have been, going through. So, and this has been somewhat centric for the northeastern U.S. That's biased coming from Denver, of course, but, and so that would be a really good example. This is what I've been thinking about the last 10 or 20 minutes is, that'd be a great example in Virginia since it's in Ed's region, and we could have a city in the south, and we could use some of the processes from the northeast. And then coming from Denver, I don't know, like Sarah's here, and they've got 26 cities in the whole metro area that Greg McPherson's group is doing for canopy cover assessment right now, prioritization processes. Maybe that's a third, the West region for Forest Service. Maybe that's another region where we can get towards these standards and some of the consistencies that everybody's looking for. And just from our side, be able to present what we've done from a private side and share those ideas and then just put that together and actually, so that's kind of where I've been thinking the last 20 minutes or so is how do we do that? And maybe that's an opportunity, because I would love to, especially in the stuff in Virginia the next 6 months, is to use some of that. So the other really quick note, and this is a really small thing I just wanted to mention because I think it's kind of important and sort of fun, is we're talking about ecosystem services, and when we talk about urban tree canopy, one of the things that popped in my mind is, like Dave and I have both worked with Oakville, Ontario. They called it urban forest canopy. So we did a UFC study for them, and that's what they wanted. Well, it's partly because they included shrub as part of the overall component, and that was a choice they wanted to make. But one of the things that struck me is, from a goal-setting standpoint, is maybe we need to have forest cover, given the huge differences in ecosystem services that forests provide, especially here in the basically eastern U.S., let's say. So maybe we have forest cover goals, and then we have tree cover goals. So that might be something we should also consider, if hopefully that makes sense.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to make your comment about the percentages. I'm sure it's right. At this point, I'm not sure what's right. What I do know, what I do know, and I think it's kind of ironic, after all that 36, 35, 38, the mayor came out with a sustainability goal, and guess how much he said it was? 35%. So I thought that, I was like, rock on, Vince. But it's they don't care. I mean, they're going to take 30. I mean, I do this all the time. My staff says we had 37 people in the class yesterday. Say, okay, so we had 40. Like, no, Mark, we had 37. I'm like, no, we had 40. They say we had 32. I'll say we have 30. I mean, they round to numbers that their constituents will understand. That's what those guys are in office for, because they understand that stuff. So again, it kind of gets back to how precise do we need to be? The accuracy is important, but how precise do we need to be in our articulation of that? So anyway, thanks.
Yeah, that's a good example of like something that Jarlath and I have for years now emailed back and forth on. This is the first time in 6 years we've ever met in person. Is rounding to the nearest whole number, and that's a practice that we weren't doing even a year ago, and now we are. So it's just little things like that for consistency's purposes and so forth. So anyway.
Well, I guess I want to share one of the ways that we have been working with in the case of the Forest Service, and we have a number of different urban field stations, and have worked with a number of different cities. And our idea is that we, and those field stations are Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, and Chicago. And I didn't go by order of date, but just by geographically. And we look to, a strong interest in Seattle and San Juan and other places. And the way that we've been doing things is that we try out an approach in one city. We pilot it, then we prototype it into a number of cities. And at some point we get into what I would call enterprise mode. And so, Dave piloted the different components of iTree, and that's moved out. We piloted UTC in Baltimore, and then it moved out. StuMap was first piloted in New York City, and then it's moved out. And I think that we're at a point now where something like stewardship mapping we're ready to go to enterprise mode. We pretty much figured out how to do it. And while we see that there are ways that we could do it better, I think that we're good enough to roll. Okay, with UTC prioritization, I think that we first piloted it in New York City, and then we've worked to enhance it both as a tool and as the practice. Just like you invent the hammer, and then you got to work on how to swing the hammer. And we've been really working on how to swing the hammer, or I guess apply the shovel. And now we're looking at other cities where to do that with the prioritization, places like Philadelphia. And so we have that built-in network. Looking at other places like, as you mentioned, whether it's Denver and other things, both the prioritization as a tool and as a practice is where we need to start to move out. But that's kind of the business model that we've used for how to think through these. Everything that we develop is shared because you paid for it already as a federal taxpayer, and so we share these, and we provide support for them. We don't want it to go too big too quickly, because the ability to provide support for it would be difficult, and we try to build communities of practice. So it may not be me who could provide the best assistance, but maybe it's the city of Baltimore, or it could be the private sector of which you're a part. So this is kind of the approach that we've taken, and so the UTC tools are available, our ability to share the practice is available, and it continues to evolve, and that I think is one of the cool and exciting and super frustrating pieces to it.
Any other questions?
I think we've got a few.
Oh, go ahead. Didn't see you. Oh, Mike, you're up next, Mike. Go ahead.
Thanks, Mike Galvin from Save-A-Tree. And
wasn't sure that was the line. Go ahead.
I have a comment for Janet, if I could. I'm going to take it as a given that we agree that nature is good for the environment. And if we do that, it's understandable when the regulatory process came in for Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act that many of the regulatory mechanisms were end-of-the-pipe mechanisms. And one of the things we see a lot of struggling with is those regulatory structures recognizing natural resources offsets. You have things like surplus and additionality, which result in perverse outcomes like a mature forest being cut down and replanted as seedlings because the regulatory requirement wasn't the cause for the forest existing, but it's the cause for the seedlings existing, and therefore it's creditable. And I would just suggest that you may need to not nibble around the edges of trying to make the end-of-the-pipe regulatory solution fit natural resources offsets, but you may need a somewhat different category to make that work. And thank you for looking at it. We really appreciate it.
If I may, about your end-of-the-pipe comment, a good friend of mine, Garrett Finney, was hired by NASA to develop plant systems to generate oxygen on the space station, and he got nowhere. And finally, one of the engineers said, "Well, we're funding you because it looks good, but honestly, plants are really unreliable." And Garrett had to think about it. He goes, "Oh, what they're saying is, what happens if all the plants die?" And that was the only system that we had for oxygen. It'd be like, unfortunate. So I understand I guess what I want to say is I understand the end of the pipe attitude, because the end of the pipe systems are reliable. in terms of control. And so I understand the reticence to go with the systems that, are not so reliable, and our trees are not as reliable, from an engineering perspective. And I'm always reminded of my friend Garrett Finney, who realized that he was just show for the space station.
My name is Kathy Wolf with the University of Washington, and I have a comment concerning some of the things that you said, Mark. The idea of standardization across the country. Here's another prospect. I have 3 brothers that are building contractors, residential building, and they can go into most planning departments across this country, and they'll have a pretty good idea what the electrical code will be, what the plumbing code will be, what sorts of roads they've got to put within their building developments. We don't have that with regard to urban forestry. Several years ago, I did a review of local code with regard to urban forestry, one element, parking lots. And my goodness, what a diversity of approaches across communities. Do you have 1 tree per 20 spaces? Do you have 1 tree per 3 spaces? Is it cover over the parking lot, or is it around the edge? Is it in the center? So I think as part of standardization and the regulatory approach, so we've talked primarily at the national level and maybe the state level with regard to a regulatory approach, but I think dipping down into that local level and providing some guidelines would be helpful as well.
Yeah, I just want to say one thing. You're absolutely right. And those local jurisdictions are the ones that are calling us up and asking us those questions. And it's hard to provide guidance because the numbers are all over the place. And even to get to your parking example, is it 500 cubic feet of soil to get a healthy tree, or is it 1,000? Or, synthesis of data is something we don't really do a lot of, or enough of, I should say. And I think that's really important. I also want to mention that slide that I fell in love with about a year ago, was updated and given to me by Dr. Bill Sullivan, who's in the audience, of course. And if you have any questions about the implications of that, he'll be here to answer those for you. Thanks.
I'm still Randy Neprash from Minnesota. I've got a tricky question for all the panelists. It's regarding providing better scientific support for quantifying the benefits and services of urban trees in the regulatory context. And I want to list some facts that seem to be apparent from all the discussions today. One is the agencies are interested and even eager to get the information that they need. 2, that we are relatively close to having that information in hand. 3, the benefits of using that information and improving, strengthening the regulatory program appear to be enormous. We're talking real commitments, quantifiable and enforceable by local governmental units all over the country. We're talking about immense funding levels. We're talking about being able to reach beyond public projects into private land use decisions through things like ordinances, incentive programs, and utility fee crediting programs. In light of all those facts, should addressing the research needs in the regulatory context be of the highest priority?
Wow.
Yes.
Excellent.
But I think that, where I think a lot of cities are going to be heading to is a stormwater utility fee. Yeah. And I think that is where you're going to have the ability to work with, so a private landowner's assessment is going to be related to the land cover. And so that's going to enter into being able to have that conversation about the being able to certify what's on there, and having some kind of access or really kind of conversation about, is it there? How long has it been there? How healthy is it? And those kinds of conversations. So I think that a lot of the regulatory enforcement issues that we get concerned with, and that are, of course, legitimate, is going to be easier to deal with in terms of water, right? I think that's where the leading edge is going to be for us to work through these things. And certainly what we're getting to two things. One of which is, I mean, the direction that the issues that you address are the ones that we're encountering. So in the case of Baltimore City, Department of Public Works is saying, can we start to give them numbers on the role that trees and different kinds of land cover systems and really different kinds of green up infrastructure will play in terms of their MS4 permit and regulatory compliance. And then is it defensible, and will Maryland Department of the Environment accept those numbers? And then by proxy will EPA accept those numbers? So that's a whole world. Okay. Then the other thing is, and I think DC is actually great about this, is can we get everyone who plants a tree, all those NGOs, the private sector, everyone, we need to, the city gets to take credit for every single one of those trees that's planted. They aren't restricted to taking credit for trees that only they plant. So we need to get a system of inventorying, of registering all of those trees so that the city can take credit for them. And so this is another piece of the property coalitions that need to occur. And so that's another thing that we got to solve, right? So there's a regulatory piece, but then there's an accounting inventory piece that we got to start to solve too.
I guess I would just add that I think the work is happening, and this conversation is illustrating that this kind of these kinds of activities really do bring into the air quality regulatory world partners and stakeholders who weren't there before, who have their own expertise and their own motivation for wanting to provide the kind of science and research and information that will allow regulators to get more comfortable with the idea of untrustworthy trees as an air quality planning mechanism.
One last question.
I just have this is Laura Jackson with EPA, and I just had a short comment back to the issue of doing a national survey of tree cover across cities. I wasn't sure how many people were aware of the national land cover data set that's produced from 30-meter satellite imagery by USGS and EPA and NOAA and the Forest Service, and it's freely available. Well, their latest update, which is from 2011 land cover, is supposed to be imminent. I think it may get caught up a little bit possibly in the sequestration issue, but it should be fairly soon coming out. And they have percent canopy cover throughout urban areas as well as the whole coterminous U.S., and that is directly comparable to the 2001 product of percent canopy cover. And this is much better data than what Jarlath was referring to with the land cover classification data, which is masked out in urban areas anywhere that's over like 20% impervious. It's just, there's no cover data for that. But the percent canopy cover is throughout, and it would be probably pretty useful for people calling for a national registry and inventory for urban areas. And I believe Dave has told me, I think, that it still underestimates canopy cover in cities, but they have developed a correction factor for it. So it could be something, it's very broad brush again, but you get data for the whole nation, and now we have 2 points in time too. So that may answer some of the calls, at least in the short term, that we've heard for that data.